In the ancient and medieval worlds, justice wasn't just a verdict, it was a show. And for the person condemned, their final moments were often a carefully crafted nightmare, designed to send a clear and terrifying message. Today, we're exploring the darkest chapters of history to look at the most brutal execution methods ever devised and the infamous figures who perfected them. We'll start with punishments that were shockingly common and count our way down to the truly diabolical. This isn't a celebration of violence, it's a look into the nature of power, fear, and what our ancestors called justice. So, why were these methods so unbelievably cruel? Well, the answer isn't simple. They were tools of state power, designed to be a public deterrent and to show everyone the absolute authority of a ruler. Think of it as propaganda, staged to project an image of strength and scare anyone who might even think about breaking the law. The more horrific the execution, the louder the message. Often, the punishment was symbolic, a twisted kind of poetic justice meant to mirror the crime. And these weren't hidden affairs. People were encouraged, sometimes even required, to attend. They were a theater of horror where the line between justice and entertainment got terrifyingly blurry. We're going to count down from 8, with each method more chilling than the last. We'll examine not just how they killed, but the psychological terror they were meant to create. Which one was the worst? That's a question for you to consider as we go. Our countdown begins on the high seas with a punishment that combined the terror of drowning with the agony of being flayed alive. Keel hauling. While we often picture it in pirate movies, its most documented use was by the Dutch Navy starting in the 16th century, though some form of it may have existed earlier. It was all about enforcing brutal discipline on the waves, where mutiny was a captain's greatest fear. The process was as simple as it was vicious. A sailor was tied to a rope looped underneath the ship. Then he was thrown overboard and dragged at the speed of the vessel, down and under the keel, the ship's spine, and, if he was lucky, up the other side. The horror here came from all directions. First, you had the very real chance of drowning. Depending on the ship's width, holding your breath for that long was nearly impossible. But drowning was almost a mercy. The real torture came from the hull itself. A ship's bottom was a jagged mess of razor-sharp barnacles and splintered wood. As the victim was dragged across it, their skin was shredded. If they were pulled too quickly, the force of the water could cause massive head trauma, knocking them out and guaranteeing they'd drown. Too slowly, and it just prolonged the feeling of being grated like cheese against the hull. Even surviving the pass wasn't a guarantee. Sailors who came out the other side were often so horrifically wounded that they'd die from infection days later. Keel hauling wasn't just a death sentence, it was a statement that on the open ocean, the captain's power was absolute. At number 7, we leave the sea for the courtroom with a method that was less about a quick death and more about slow, agonizing persuasion. This is peine forte et dure, or hard and forceful punishment, known more simply as pressing. This torture was especially common in English law and was notoriously used during the Salem witch trials. Its purpose was unique. It wasn't a punishment for a crime, but for refusing to cooperate with the court. Thanks to a bizarre legal loophole, if you refused to plead guilty or not guilty, you couldn't be tried. So, to force a plea, the court used this. The accused was laid on their back on a cold stone floor, and a heavy board was placed on their chest. Then, one by one, heavy stones were piled on top, gradually increasing the weight. The pressure would slowly crush the victim's ribcage, making every breath a battle. The goal was to inflict such unbearable pain that the person would finally agree to enter a plea. But there was a grim logic to staying silent. In cases of treason or witchcraft, a conviction meant the government took all your property, leaving your family with nothing. By refusing to plead and dying under the stones, a person could technically die innocent in the eyes of the law, allowing their family to inherit their estate. The most famous case is that of Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer accused of witchcraft in Salem in 1692. For 2 days, Corey refused to plead as the weight was increased. He endured the crushing pressure, and when his tongue was forced from his mouth, the sheriff reportedly shoved it back in with his cane. According to legend, his final defiant words weren't a plea, but a demand. More weight. Giles Corey was crushed to death, the only documented person in colonial American history to die this way. His defiance helped turn public opinion against the trials, making him a martyr. Our sixth most brutal execution is one of history's most iconic: burning at the stake. The image of a victim engulfed in flames is seared into our collective memory, a symbol of religious persecution and the Inquisition. This method was used for centuries but became infamous in Europe as the go-to punishment for heresy and witchcraft. The logic behind it was rooted in religious doctrine. Fire was seen as a purifying element. For a heretic whose soul was believed to be tainted, death by fire was seen as a way to cleanse their sin. For witches believed to have dealt with the devil, fire was the ultimate form of divine punishment. The execution was a highly public ritual. The condemned was tied to a stake with wood and straw piled at their feet. As a small act of mercy, particularly in England, a bag of gunpowder was sometimes hung around the victim's neck to speed things up. In other cases, an executioner might be ordered to strangle the victim with a cord right before the flames were lit, a mercy granted to those who confessed. But for many there was no mercy. As the fire was lit, the first moments were chaos and searing heat. The flames would burn the lower body first, causing unimaginable pain. Death, when it came, was from a combination of severe burns, carbon monoxide poisoning, and shock. It was rarely quick. The public nature of the event was key. It was a terrifying warning and a demonstration of the absolute power of the church and state, turning the victim's body into a public sermon on the price of defiance. At number 5, we find a device designed for one thing: the systematic destruction of the human body. This is the breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel. It was used in Europe for centuries, reserved for the worst crimes like aggravated murder. Its purpose wasn't just to kill, but to do it in the most visually horrifying way possible. There were two main ways this went down. In one, the victim was tied spread-eagled to a large wooden cartwheel. The executioner then used a heavy iron bar to systematically shatter their limbs, aiming for the gaps between the spokes to ensure the bones broke cleanly. This was a calculated process. A less severe sentence might call for a top-down execution, where the first blow was to the chest, a so-called merciful coup de grace, before the limbs were broken. But for the most hated criminals, the sentence was bottom-up. The executioner would start with the ankles, slowly working their way up the body, breaking bone after bone, making sure the victim stayed conscious for as long as possible. In the second, even more horrifying method, the now broken body would be woven through the spokes of the wheel, the mangled limbs threaded and twisted into an unnatural shape. The wheel, with the still living victim grotesquely displayed on it, was then hoisted onto a tall pole. Here, the suffering continued. Exposed to the elements, the victim would slowly die over hours or even days from shock and dehydration, left as a feast for birds. The breaking wheel was the ultimate expression of the state's power to not just take a life, but to completely dismantle a human being. Number 4 is probably the most famous execution method in history, an image so powerful it became the central symbol for a major world religion: crucifixion. It was perfected by the Romans as the ultimate tool of public shame and agonizing death, but its history goes back even further to the Persians and Carthaginians. Crucifixion was designed to be slow, humiliating, and excruciatingly painful. It was considered so horrific that it was reserved for the lowest members of society: slaves, rebels, and criminals who weren't Roman citizens. For a citizen, crucifixion was an unthinkable disgrace. The goal was to inflict maximum pain while creating an unforgettable deterrent. The ordeal started long before the cross. The condemned was usually scourged, a brutal whipping that could be fatal on its own. They were then often forced to carry their own crossbeam through the streets to the execution site. Once there, they were stripped naked, adding another layer of shame to the suffering. The victim was then attached to the cross, either with ropes or, more famously, with iron nails driven through the wrists and feet. Nailing the wrists, not the palms, provided a secure anchor and would sever the median nerve, causing bolts of agonizing pain to shoot up the arms. The cross was then hoisted upright, leaving the person to hang. Death by crucifixion was a torturous fight against suffocation. To breathe out, the victim had to push up on their nailed feet to relieve the pressure on their chest. This movement sent searing pain through their body. Eventually, exhaustion would set in, and the victim, unable to push up anymore, would slowly suffocate over a period that could last for days. To speed things up, Roman soldiers sometimes broke the victim's legs, making it impossible for them to breathe. The execution of 6,000 of Spartacus's followers along the Appian Way is a chilling reminder of its use as a tool of mass terror. At number 3, we have a method so connected to one historical figure that his name has become a synonym for cruelty. This is impalement, the signature punishment of Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler. While Vlad turned it into an art form of psychological warfare, impalement had been used long before his time, but under his rule in the 15th century, he used it on a terrifying scale to crush his enemies, especially the invading Ottoman Turks. The mechanics were diabolically simple. A large, sharpened stake was the instrument of death. The tip was often rounded and oiled, not to be kind, but to push vital organs aside instead of piercing them, prolonging the victim's suffering. The victim was forced onto the stake, which was inserted through the rectum or vagina. Sometimes a horse was used to force the stake deeper, or the stake was simply stood upright, letting the victim's own weight do the horrifying work. As the stake slowly moved through the body, it would eventually emerge from the shoulder, chest, or mouth. A skilled executioner could keep the victim alive for hours, even days. Vlad reportedly took this a step further, arranging the impaled bodies in geometric patterns. The most famous story, though likely an exaggeration, tells of a forest of 20,000 impaled Turkish soldiers, a sight so horrifying it supposedly caused the invading sultan to turn back in disgust. Vlad used impalement for any crime, from theft to treason, and was said to have dined among the dying. It was his brand of terror, a message that his cruelty knew no bounds. Our runner-up for the most brutal execution takes us to Imperial China. This is Lingchi, which translates to slow slicing, but is better known in the West as the death by 1,000 cuts. This punishment, which was only banned in 1905, was reserved for the most heinous crimes imaginable, like treason or murdering one's own parents. What made Lingchi so terrifying wasn't just the physical pain, but the psychological and spiritual destruction it represented. The process was a public ritual designed to maximize suffering. The condemned was tied to a wooden frame in a public square. An executioner would then use a sharp knife to methodically slice away parts of the victim's body over an extended period. The process often began with cuts to the chest and the slicing of flesh from the arms and thighs. A skilled executioner could make numerous cuts without killing the victim too quickly. Opium was sometimes given not as mercy, but to keep the person from passing out, ensuring they were conscious for as much of the ordeal as possible. The execution would end with the amputation of limbs, followed by a final cut to the heart or beheading. But the horror extended beyond death. In Chinese tradition, keeping the body whole in death was essential for the afterlife. By being systematically dismembered, the victim wasn't just killed. They were believed to be mutilated for eternity, denied a peaceful existence after death. This spiritual annihilation was considered a fate far worse than just dying, making Lingchi the most feared punishment in the Chinese legal system. It was the complete erasure of a person, physically, publicly, and spiritually. We've arrived at number 1, the method that, for its sheer inventive sadism, earns the title of history's most brutal execution. It's a punishment that weaponizes the very processes of life, turning sweetness into a source of horror. This is the ancient Persian method known as scaphism, or simply the boats. Now, it's important to say that its actual use is debated by historians. Our knowledge of it comes almost entirely from ancient Greek writers describing what they claimed the Persians did. There's no direct Persian evidence, but the picture they painted is one of cruelty so creative, it's hard to believe. The punishment began by taking two small rowboats. The victim was placed inside one, and the second was placed on top, creating a grotesque coffin. Holes were cut for the victim's head, hands, and feet to stick out. Then the real torture started. They would force-feed the victim a mixture of milk and honey until they were violently ill. This same sticky mixture was then smeared all over their exposed face, hands, and feet, making them an irresistible target for insects. The boat was then towed into a stagnant swamp and left in the sun. The force-feeding had a predictable effect: severe diarrhea. Trapped inside the boat, the victim would begin to fester in their own filth. This vile combination of honey, milk, and human waste created a paradise for insects. Flies and wasps would swarm the victim, feeding on the honey and laying eggs in their flesh. But the true horror was happening inside. As the filth built up, it attracted vermin that would burrow into the victim's body, breeding and slowly eating them alive from the inside out. The force feeding was repeated daily to keep them alive as their body rotted and was consumed. Death, when it finally came after days or even weeks, would be from dehydration, septic shock, and infection. It is an execution that combines helplessness, filth, and the slow, gnawing terror of being eaten alive. From crushing stones to being consumed by insects, these methods reveal a dark and twistedly inventive side of human history. They were more than punishments. They were terrifying rituals designed to maintain order and project power, writing warnings in blood and bone. The line between justice and cruelty is something societies have always struggled with, and while these specific methods are in the past, the questions they raise are timeless. What is the real purpose of punishment, and how does a society make sure its quest for justice doesn't just become pure brutality? Looking back at these horrors forces us to confront the darkest parts of human nature, but it also shows how far our ideas of law and human dignity have come. Now, we want to hear from you. Which of these methods do you find the most horrifying, and why? Are there any others you think should have been on this list? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this journey into the shadows of the past fascinating, please give this video a like and subscribe to Ancient Vault for more deep dives into history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching.